The next mandatory Supreme Court case you need to know, and the second involving the topic of gerrymandering, is the more recent Supreme Court gerrymandering case, which is Shaw v. Reno. Shaw is a white resident of North Carolina, basically filing a lawsuit on behalf of five white residents of North Carolina. And Reno is Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General at this time period of the United States, the person that ran the Department of Justice, which is obviously a cabinet level position. So here's the background. This case involves gerrymandering in North Carolina, or drawing of districts in North Carolina. So the root of the dispute is that North Carolina had a history of being unwilling as a state to elect African American representatives. Between 1865, when African Americans gained the right to vote, and 1993, North Carolina had only elected seven African American members to the House of Reps. And in 1990, despite African Americans making up well north of 20% of the state population, there were zero African American representatives. So this is sort of like the backstory is North Carolina's general reluctance to elect African American sort of members of Congress. The next step in sort of the background info. There's a little bit more background info to this case than some of the others. Um, in 1990 was a census year. And as we've mentioned, every 10 years, we do our best to count up the number of people that live in this country. What we do is that based on that census data, we adjust the number of representatives that each state has in the House of Reps. We've frozen the number of representatives at 435, but every 10 years, we rejuggle, redistribute, reapportion is the term, the number of reps that each state has. So because of the 1990 census data, it was determined that the state of North Carolina would get an extra member of Congress, an extra congressional district. It's hard to see, but it says +1 here, right? So the state of North Carolina be gaining a representative, which meant that had to be factored into the districts as they were drawn, because once you rejuggle the numbers, you have to redraw the district. So it's reapportionment first, and then redistricting second. Deeper backstory. In 1965, there was a law passed called the Voting Rights Act. This was meant to provide additional protections to African American voters. That despite that this was 100 years after the 15th Amendment awarded African American males the right to vote, there were still southern states that were engaged in practices that would limit the amount of African Americans who would be able to vote. So the 1965 Voting Rights Act required that southern states, those pictured, and other states too, pictured in the green, so you can see it, North Carolina is included in the lighter shade, but still pictured, that had a history of discriminating against African American voters would have to get what we call preclearance for any kind of voting changes that were being made from the Department of Justice, right? Which, again, remember at this time is led by Janet Reno. She's the one named in a lawsuit. And this would allow the Department of Justice to look at the changes that these states of the green were making to make sure that they were being made for legitimate purposes and not for some other reason. So, as part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, still, in the 1990s, North Carolina was impacted, right, by this law. So when they went to redraw their congressional districts and add that extra one in based on, reapportionment, they submitted the plan to the Department of Justice as they were required to by the Voting Rights Act, and the Department of Justice rejected it and then required them to essentially redraw the districts in a way in which the new district would be drawn to specifically be a majority minority district, meaning that the district would have to be drawn in a way that would make the African American statewide minority population the majority within this new district, sort of hoping that a larger number of African American voters captured within a singular district would be more likely to vote for an African American representative and make up for that deficiency that North Carolina had for a while. So that is sort of the background. And again, it's important for you to know that a majority minority district is simply a district that would be drawn to make the minority group the majority within that particular district. And again, this was being required by the Department of Justice that was being led by Janet Reno. So right here, the purple district is the new district that was drawn, that essentially was the majority minority district ordered by the Department of Justice. 5 white voters sued, alleging discrimination. Their argument was that having African Americans intentionally be drawn to be the majority group within this district intentionally, by the government, was essentially discriminating against white voters. They argued that this district was like way too spread out. It's spread out for like 160 miles. I mean, it's huge. It's oddly shaped. And then, really, if you look at it, because it went from like one part of the state to another, that there wasn't much these people had in common, other than like their race. And essentially, this was discriminatory, like as a result. So they sued, alleging that this new district was discriminatory. The constitutional connection is the same as in Baker v. Carr. Because these white voters are alleging discrimination, it's the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which is the basis for every discrimination lawsuit in this country. The question was the majority minority district, right, that was being ordered to be drawn by the Department of Justice to be this extra district in North Carolina, was this a violation of the Equal Protection Clause? And it was a decision that was pretty close, but it was 5-4, yes. And the decision of the Supreme Court was that grouping people over a very large area that have little in common except the color of their skin bears a strong resemblance to segregation. And the acknowledgement was that clearly the purpose of drawing this district was to help a minority group. But at the same time, they looked at this as being too reliant on race and too discriminatory, and that racial classifications, like this, um, promote like stereotypes, like the idea that like having an African American majority district assumes that they would just vote for minority candidates, African American candidates, and that was discriminatory in itself, like that type of thinking. So this basically invalidated majority minority districts, and basically overturned this, required North Carolina to redraw their districts, and prevented other states from drawing majority minority districts when they redistricted in the future.